There seems to be an ongoing debate about people who want to manage bees more naturally and less intensive versus those who need to manage bees in a more intensive manner. And I'll just touch on some of that and some thoughts about it. There's no right or wrong answer, and you can keep bees in many ways. So let's start. I'll start by saying beekeeping has changed from about 30 years ago, I would say. We've always had American foul brood, and we've also had things like nosema that would affect overwintering. But we've had a lot of new pests come into beekeeping, and in some cases, we feel like we have to actively treat for those. And so I just put these up here because even if you lose a colony through the winter or through the summer, you're often asking yourself, did I do something wrong? Or was it a disease? And so you send something to the National Bee Unit and get some analysis done. But there's a lot of debate about what is affecting honeybees these days. And so if you ask a particular beekeeper on a particular year, they might say, well, this year it rained all summer, so nutrition, my bees got almost no nutrition this year. So that could be a thing. Or if it's winter, maybe you were affected by nosema. So every year can be different. There are those that say, I was near winter oilseed rape, and it was a pesticide exposure. All these things can be true. It can be pesticides. What I like to think about, at least in North America, we've been losing about 30% of our colonies almost every year. We manage fairly intensively. A lot of commercial beekeepers manage very intensively. But I call it the 4 Ps, and it's poor nutrition. It's not all here, but poor nutrition, pesticides, pathogens, and pests. So there's 4 different things, but what it starts with is nutrition. If the bees don't have good nutrition, they can't fight off any of these other things. So for me, it's all about having strong bees, strong, well-fed bees. And we can't always control that, especially with climate change. I mean, you have summers and falls that are different, and the bees don't always get the nutrition they need. But for me, these 4 things are impacting how successful our beekeeping is. So if you're an intensive beekeeper and you know there's no nutrition, you're going to start feeding them pollen and syrup. But then there's a group of beekeepers that say, no, I'll live and let die. Just let them work through this hard time. So there's debate both ways. Just trying to think about why bees are dying in general. If 30 or 40 years ago, you might lose 5 to 10% of your colonies for various reasons if you were a really good beekeeper. In fact, in the US, if you lost more than 5%, people thought something was wrong. So that's historic. Then Varroa came in, and in my opinion, it at least doubled, the impact of Varroa at least doubled the loss rate. And then in the US, we had this rise in losses, and we were trying to figure out, why are we increasing in our losses? And that it happened for quite some time. And we called it the big elephant in the room. And in my opinion, and this is, I think Dave Goulson would hold the same opinion, it is consistent low-level pesticide exposure and some of the changes in neonics being water-soluble. So depending on where you keep bees, you may have exposure to pesticides. And it's not that it kills the bees directly, but it weakens them. So I think pesticides is playing a role, and to me, that's kind of an explanation of how things have compounded over time. And again, this goes back, you see the pollen in the background. To me, if the bees are very, very well fed, they can overcome many of these problems. So this is a picture. This is a picture of intensive bee management. Every one of those is either a 4-way pallet or a 6-way pallet of bees going into California almonds. I don't have my migratory map in the next slide, but I'll spend a minute on this. In the US and Australia in some places, bees are a part of agricultural production. And we can argue that the agricultural production system is wrong. It's way too big. But right now, We produce about 80% of the world's almonds, and we put over 2 million colonies into almonds every spring. So we have a huge country, and let's say this is California. We used to move bees just from the middle of the country into almonds. We managed 3.5 million, and we need 2 million, over 2 million in California. So now they come from all over the US and move into almonds in January and February. So it's a very intensive kind of beekeeping. I'm not saying it's right, but the almond growers are demanding that the beekeepers show up, and they pay a very, very high price. So this one crop is driving the commercial beekeeping in North America, or in the US. And these beekeepers know, and they are treating their bees as livestock, because January and February is a very early time for the bees to be building up. So they're doing protein feeding to push them and get them stronger for this one crop. And that brings me to the livestock discussion. If you think about agriculture, we could have a wild cow out there that is in our pasture. It's just a kind of a pet, or maybe we milk it occasionally. But with many of the things in apples, cows, whatever, we've selected and we pushed them so that they actually wouldn't survive very well in the wild. A dairy cow is not going to do that well out on her own. So this is what I'm trying to drive home with this image, that our agricultural production system, I think, has gotten too big. It needs to be smaller and more localized, shorten the food chain. But right now, in many areas of the world, we have this large agricultural production system, and some of the units in there, the cows, the apples, the almonds, we're growing at too large a rate. But it's also driving the beekeeping, the pollination that needs to go there. Now back to the bees a little bit. The bees that you're managing today, maybe you're managing buckfast or Apis mellifera mellifera, they really haven't changed that much. I mean, if you think about it, they're still going through the same cycles, they're still swarming. So from the time, 3,000 years ago, the bees are really basically the same. What's changed is our management and what we do with them and things. So the bees have remained the same. We've done some selection. We have some that are gentler. We have some that produce more honey, but they really haven't changed that much. It's the beekeeping that's changed. I talked about this a couple of days ago. If you look at the world map, in the northern hemisphere, we treat for Varroa, we do a lot of different things that in the southern hemisphere, Africa, Latin America, that they don't do. They don't treat for Varroa. The bees there deal with Varroa. And I'm bringing up Varroa because it is a primary stressor of bees right now in northern hemisphere. It's also into this debate of intensive management, treating for Varroa, and not treating for Varroa. Can we get away with not treating for Varroa? So I bring it up that it's a northern hemisphere problem in a sense. Now I'll tell a little side story, and this is about Varroa came from Apis cerana bees. They're in the Asian honeybee, and it moved off of Apis cerana on our European bees. And in Apis cerana, it doesn't cause any problem. It reproduces only on drone brood, and on drone brood, not much of an impact. We don't need that many males, right? I mean, in general. And so it reproduces on drones, and we can never find it in the worker brood of Apis cerana. So there was a nice study done. We thought if we could find out why it's not going into worker brood in Apis cerana, we would solve our Varroa problem in our bees, our Apis mellifera bees. So finally, there was someone who I think solved the issue. Why is Apis cerana not affected by Varroa? And what happens is the Varroa can move into worker brood, but then the brood actually just dies. And when the brood dies, the Varroa dies. So if Varroa does make the mistake and go into worker brood in this Asian honeybee, the brood dies, the Varroa dies. So they don't do it very often. They stay on drone brood. So this was in 2016. So we now have this answer from Apis cerana, but reality is it doesn't help us much with our bees, Apis mellifera. The reason Varroa causes a problem with our bees, they prefer drone brood, but they go into worker brood, and they feed on worker brood and weaken our colonies. But anyway, so we had some advancement in our knowledge of Varroa, but it's really not helping us much with our fight with Varroa. This is just a stylized thing of Varroa and bee population. And this gets at the question I'm trying to address is, should we treat or should we not treat? The mites are generally low in the spring, and then they start going up in the fall. And most people, are going to treat in the summer or maybe early spring, keep this curve down, or certainly by the fall they're going to treat here. The bees increase in the summer and they go down, so you have an increase in the number of parasites in that colony in the fall if you don't treat. But there are beekeepers, and I've met many of them here, who don't treat at all. So why are the bees able to survive? Well, they must have some mechanisms that they can deal with this increase in mite levels. They're somehow fighting the mites off. So this is without treatment. We expect that without treatment, the mites should explode in the fall. What are some of the possible resistance mechanisms? There's a lot of things listed there. There's been several workshops and things talking about some of these. Stephen Martin has done some excellent work on this recapping behavior. And in a conversation with him, he told me he thinks it's not the recapping behavior itself that's causing the reduction in mites. The recapping behavior is an indication that they're doing a lot of other things relative to hygienic behavior or Varroa-sensitive hygiene. So he thinks it's a sign of some other behaviors that this recapping behavior. And it's a fairly new thing. So the bees, this is a cell and it's capped over, and there's something developing there. If there's a Varroa in there, or sometimes even if there's not, they'll uncap the cell and then just simply recap it without removing anything. And that's what we call recapping. And you can look for it in your own bees. There was a workshop on it. You look for a change in the capping. You just uncap it. You'll see, let's say, light brown capping, and in the middle will be dark brown. So you can tell that it was uncapped and recapped. But again, there's a number of ways that bees can naturally fight off Varroa. They can actually bite and damage mites. Oh, I list something down there. I'll get to that, the COVID defense mechanism. That's my own creation. I'll get there in a minute. But most of you would know hygienic behavior, and there's a couple of kinds of hygienic behavior where they detect something's in there, a chalk brood or whatever, and they pull it out and remove it. Some of that can work on Varroa as well. So there's a lot of different defense mechanisms that bees can use. There's a specialized kind of hygiene that's Varroa-sensitive hygiene, targeted at cells that contain Varroa. This is this recapping behavior. The bee simply finds a cell, investigates it, uncaps it, and then recaps the cell. Sometimes they remove, but generally they're just uncapping, recapping. But again, according to Stephen Martin, and I have to believe him because he's done some excellent work, that he thinks it's just a sign of an overall other indicators of hygienic behavior. You can look for this in your own bees. If you have bottom board trays, you can collect the fallen mites. You'll need a magnifying loupe or something, and you can look for the proportion of mites that have fallen down that are damaged in some way. They're either the part of the carapace is cracked, here it's cracked, or the legs are missing. It's actually pretty obvious when you see it. And we just count, you say 100 mites, and maybe 30 to 40% of them are damaged. That's fairly high grooming or biting behavior. The key is that if you think about it, bees are not going to focus on one defense mechanism. A cultural control is making splits. So in the spring, when you make a split, the split's going to have a lower rate of Varroa growth, but also the parent colony. If you have two parent colonies, one you make a split from and one you don't, this one that you made a split from, it'll lower the mite population, and the split will have a lower mite population. So something just about making the split helps it out. This parent colony you left alone, the mites will grow faster. So it's a cultural control. It's also very similar to what bees naturally do, which is swarm. When bees swarm, that breaks the brood cycle a bit, and you lower the Varroa population. So as we fight against swarming, we're actually helping Varroa a bit. With all these different resistance mechanisms, and we want to have bees that are naturally resistant, do we really have to learn them, and do we have to go in and test for them in our bees? I don't think so. And this is a fellow from the Netherlands, Thierry Blaquier, and he's published a paper about, he called it Darwin's black box method. And all it simply means is you select, you don't treat for Varroa, and you look in, and you have to measure Varroa in these colonies, and you select from the ones with the lowest Varroa levels, and you propagate those. But you don't have to understand the mechanisms at all. You don't have to understand, what type of grooming behavior or hygienic behavior they're using. You just know that you have 10 colonies, 20 colonies, some have lower mite levels. And in that apiary, they should all have about the same. So you keep breeding from the best, the ones with the lowest mites. And he calls this, the Darwin's black box method. And it works. It can work. You can also do it without giving it a name, just always selecting from your best colonies. But you do need to look, are they best and low Varroa? So it's a way of selecting. These are just some examples of bees that we know of survivor populations out there. Gotland, Sweden was a specific experiment. They moved 200 colonies onto this island in Sweden, and they just let them go with Varroa. And they dropped down from 200 to about 20 colonies. I think they even went lower than 20 colonies. Slowly, in 2 or 3 years, they built back. So they developed some natural resistance to Varroa. The Gotland bees, anyone who's worked with them would agree, they're not the best bees. They're fairly small colonies, and they're not that productive. You know about Tom Seeley's following of bees in this Arnott forest? They're living in natural cavities, and they've come back very strong. And then even in France, there's several populations that we know of. And I'm sure there's some here as well in the UK. But if you leave bees alone and you don't treat them, they will develop resistance over time. Can we do that as a beekeeper? Maybe you have pollination needs or you're trying to sell honey. Can you go treatment free? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Very quickly, I'm going to visit these bees on IL de Guay in France that I've been working with for a couple of years. It's a very small island. It's only 3 kilometers by 8 kilometers wide, but all the beekeepers on that island, they don't treat and they don't feed. So they're Apis mellifera, they're a very pure dark bee. And this whole group of beekeepers on that island, I was asked to go out and document, were the bees really resistant to Varroa? So I worked there for 2 years just following the Varroa levels. And I won't go through all the details, but the key is that they don't treat and they don't feed. And the reason I know they don't treat, I sampled all the beeswax from all the different operators, and the beeswax came back clean. So there was no evidence of miticide use. Simply monitor Varroa in the spring and in the fall. So from every colony, I worked with 36 colonies, 6 beekeepers. In the spring, I get a certain number of mites per bee, and in the fall, I get a mites per bee. Normally, I would expect the spring count to be here and the fall count to be way up here, without treatment. And in fact, they were more like this. The spring count was what we would think of as alarmingly high. I mean, it's like over 10 mites per 100 bee. So it was high, in our opinion. We need to treat. But then the fall count was only, let's say, 14 mites per bee. So over the summer and into the early fall, they didn't build. So the bees there are surviving quite well with no treatment. And it gives us hope that given time, you could do that in your own operation. And this is just more of that information, talking about what I would expect. I would expect the mite levels to be much higher in the fall, and they were not. So we sampled in the spring and in the fall. These are the different mechanisms that might be going on Guay. We did start to look at that, like what were these bees doing? And what I came away with was this COVID idea. And it's that it's not one simple thing that they're doing. It's the colony overall Varroa integrated defense. And that's just I would just playing on our problems in life over the past couple of years because we haven't been able to get together as beekeepers. All I'm trying to say with this is that it's highly unlikely that if you've got bees that are surviving, in wherever, in Wales or in Scotland, a population, that they're using only Varroa sensitive hygiene, or they're only biting mites. They're using a number of things. They're swarming, or they're using a number of defense mechanisms. It's not one mechanism. So that's all I'm trying to say with that. It's not, that it's the colony and their defense that matters. So now I want to say a little bit about the different types of bees in Europe. So here we are in basically the heart of Apis mellifera, the dark bee territory. But you can see in that orange, there's a lot of Apis mellifera all across, even into the, going towards Russia. That's where that bee has evolved, in colder climates. And you go down to Spain, and it's a special bee in Spain, the Iberica bee. And we all know Ligustica from Italy. It's yellow, it's a yellow bee. It produces a lot of honey. We use Ligustica bees in the U.S. We use two primarily ones, and we never had Apis mellifera, so we can use anything we want. No, that's not really fair. But we never had any naturally occurring Apis mellifera. So we use two primary ones. One is Ligustica, and that's to build up brood. They build up brood very rapidly, so we use those, and we use a lot of Carnica. Those are probably the two. Some buckfast, but those two bees are the dominant ones that people use. And they use Ligustica because of this brood rearing ability for pollination. But look at all these other subspecies. Carnica, Macedonia, Intermissa in North Africa. We think, well, we don't really need those because we're really happy with our buckfast, or we're really happy with our Italians or our Apis mellifera. But I would argue that we do need all these subspecies. We don't need to all manage them, but we need to have areas in these countries where we preserve some of that stock, high mountain valleys or isolated islands or whatever. So, and also, why did all of these subspecies evolve? So you've got our mellifera is a kind of a northern adapted bee. Why did these other bees kind of start to speciate? It's because the climate's different in all these places and the vegetation's different. And I'm saying all this because even within Apis mellifera, if you take a bee from the UK and you move it over to Poland, it's probably not going to do as well, even though it's Apis mellifera. What do the UK bees like to do? They like to fly in cool, wet weather, I guess. I mean, that's, they've adapted to the climate on the British Isles. And whereas bees in Poland, they're going to have a harder winter. Think about Poland in the winter. It's going to be a harder, longer winter than your winter here. So we need to preserve these species, and we need to find ways we can keep them isolated. So I guess I'm coming back to this. Now I'm trying to get back to the commercial beekeeping versus, should we all be treatment-free kind of thing. We know that bees can survive Varroa. We also can select for different resistance mechanisms, but you can either select or let natural selection take place. I've already touched on that. We do need these different species of bees around Europe and beyond because they hold some of the secrets to how we might, during climate change, how if an area gets warmer, maybe we want a more southern bee kind of thing. And then this is me now. I'm that last thing. Commercial beekeeping will take time to adapt. I'll say a little bit about my own beekeeping. I'm not a commercial beekeeper, but I learned commercial beekeeping in when I was a scientist and stuff. I worked with a lot of commercial beekeepers. Their only goal is to either produce honey or do pollination. So they're really driven by the commercial aspects of it. And for them, they really can't afford to let their colonies go and have losses and take 3 or 4 years to develop resistance. So that they're actively treating. But I think they need to get off that bandwagon. And the next is I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing with my bees. So this is one of my stationary apiaries. The first thing I do is I manage everything in a single box. So I don't use doubles. I kind of keep them compacted, and I end up with swarming quite often, but I don't really fight against it. I don't cut cells or anything. I'll pull a nuke if the colonies are really building up strong. I will pull a nuke out and make a nuke. But for me, I get at least half my income from pollination. So yeah, I don't cut cells. I will make a nuke when they get too strong. But this is what I do throughout the year. I manage bees on trailers because it's good for my back. I put 12 on a trailer and I can move them to different crops real easily. Watermelons, pumpkins, and squash. I use Formic Pro in the summer, so I do try to knock the mite levels down early summer when the temperatures are right, and I use oxalic acid in the fall. Honestly, I don't do a lot of Varroa monitoring. I just know that this helps my winter survival if I do this. I do have some commercially available resistant stock, and I'm kind of evaluating that. So I hope to get, in my own operation, I hope to get to a point where I don't treat at all, but I'm not there yet. And to me, that's the crux of this matter as a beekeeper. How much can I afford to not treat and maybe lose colonies over time? And so that's, I'm hoping to get there where I'm not treating at all, but I'm not there yet. Yeah, and we do produce honey. By using only oxalic acid and formic acid, I can talk to the consumer and say my honey is really pure. This is our youngest son, Kevin, and Marianne and I run a local business, and we just sell at the local market. Now, back to this idea of which bees should you be managing and should you select, et cetera. We all have a bee that we grew up with or that, that was best, or you think that, okay, no, I really prefer buckfast, or I only do mellifera. For me, it's whatever bee works for you in your area. If I were keeping on the British Isles, I would hope it would be maybe a dark bee, maybe mellifera. But if you're satisfied with buckfast and they're working for you, it's hard to argue against that. Also, I know when I came to the British Beekeepers Association, you spend an inordinate amount of time talking about hive type, just like. No, you gotta have the standard. No, yeah. So, but this debate is going on a lot with the treatment-free beekeepers because they want to put bees just in a box, even with no foundation, or just let them go. And there's nothing really particularly wrong with that. The beauty of a movable frame hive is that you can go in and look for disease, especially American foul brood. That's the beauty of movable frame. It's actually in the U.S. It's actually forbidden to have bees in skeps and things. It's because we can't inspect them. So, but I do think you can manage bees in skeps and other ways if you're careful. And American foul brood to me would be the main thing there, is watching out for American foul brood. So in this move from, well, we hunted and gathered, then we moved into apiaries, and now we've got, in some cases, these are palletized bees, more modern beekeeping. The bee itself really hasn't changed that much. It's what we've been doing with it and how we've managed it. And we've made advances, but I would say that we face more and more challenges these days. Varroa, hornets, things like that. So we have to, as beekeepers, we have to adapt. And I think what you need to do is kind of ask yourself, what am I trying to do with my bees? Do I have 2 hives in Surrey, and I just enjoy going out in the morning and watching them come in with pollen and stuff? That's beautiful. It's a beautiful way of keeping bees. You have a few garden hives, and that's all you want. And it's really nice. For me, I'm actually making a little income, and I rely on pollination. So I'm kind of in the middle somewhere between that and commercial beekeeping. But we each have to ask ourselves, why are we keeping bees? And if you really want to connect the bees more back to nature, I think we do need to move away from so many treatments. The bees can survive. We know they can survive. Bees can survive without beekeepers. We need to learn in whatever way you're managing your bees, make sure that you're doing stuff that's beneficial for the bees and not just beneficial for you. I worry, like I keep them on these trailers, and I'm worrying like, well, they're up high, and yeah, but it seems to work. I try not to crowd them, 12 on a trailer. But there is this split, whereas we can argue that agriculture needs to change. We need to diversify agriculture. and make smaller plot size, then we'll get native pollinators and everything else to help pollinate these crops. But in some cases, until we do that, until we get there, we rely on a mobile pollinator. And honeybees are about the only mobile pollinator other than bumblebees. And bumblebees are used widely in greenhouses and stuff. So we definitely need to diversify agriculture. And it'll help us. And then this is just saying that, yeah, the things that you face, climate change, pests and pathogens, they've been on the increase. So it is a bit more challenging now to keep bees, but it certainly still is rewarding as it's always been. I mean, just working with bees is a rewarding experience. So I don't think I really answered the question which way you should keep your bees, but whatever you're doing, if it's whatever local bee you have is probably the best bee to work with. So that would be my take-home message.
When you said you didn't really treat for Varroa, you just put some formic acid on in the summer and oxalic in the winter.
Yeah.
Well, that's my full treatment program. I do a bit of integrated pest management too,
yeah.
But I'm just wondering what you would treat as a full Varroa treatment program.
No, that I was saying that is my Varroa treatment program. I'm sorry if
Sorry,
so
I thought you said you didn't really treat much for it. I was wondering if the intensive farmers would also treat. Another thing I picked up was you said, I think, around about 100 colonies. I think that's a modest to respectable commercial operation in this country.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, so the most commercial beekeepers in the U.S. and probably in Australia as well, they would use one or two hard chemicals. They would use amitraz because they can put the slow release strip in and get fairly good control, unless resistance develops, which it does. And then there's also some pyrethroids that they're still using. So they use a harder chemical than the organic acids. I only use the organic acids because that way my honey's not labeled organic, but they meet organic standards in the U.S., those two products. So no, that's all I want to use. I don't cut drone brood. I do take splits out, but that's my total Varroa management, is just those two products. Yeah.
What's your favoured method of monitoring for Varroa drop?
Good question. Well, my favorite method for monitoring for Varroa drop is not to do the Varroa drop, it's to do the sugar shake. I like 300 bees in a jar with powdered sugar because I get a quick answer. But for Varroa drop, I have some boards, but where you can slide a sticky board underneath. And the key there, I think, is to just try to leave it only 24 hours. The longer you leave it, you're going to get ants and everything else trying to collect. So if you can have a sticky board or even with grease-covered board of some kind for 24 hours under the hive, and then come out and count the mites. And you could also look at them if you're really keen. You get the magnifier and look at them for damage.
I've got another question.
I'll give a pitch for the Veta Pharma and some of these other mite wash things. They work really well. They actually work really well. So you put them in those things with detergent, and they work really well, and they're simple, but they kill 300 bees. So that's why I prefer Sugar Shake.
You said about 2 million hives get transported for the almond pollination.
Yep.
How many come back? Do they die immediately, or is it like a slow?
So I had a migratory slide where I show we go from almonds to apples, and apples back on the East Coast, and blueberries, and it's a huge migratory operation. We looked at the stress, some of the stress in those movements. There's a little bit of heat stress and things, but the moving itself is not as big an issue as actually probably some of the pesticide exposure. They're going from one crop to another crop that's sprayed. So we think more of the pressure on these pollinating bees is probably the nutritional and pesticide exposure. But to answer your question directly, they actually grow on almonds. It's a really good pollen source, a fair nectar source, and when the bees come out of almonds, they're kind of exploding. Doesn't happen every year. Sometimes they sit in almonds if the weather's poor and they don't really grow up. But they put them there from middle of February and they come out mid-March. And if they're not splitting those colonies, they're going to swarm. So they actually come out of almonds in better shape generally than they went in. Yeah, so they don't all die. But in general, we're losing way too many colonies over the course of a year. Part of that is queen problems. Part of that is this. Many of our commercial colonies go on 5 pollination contracts, which is probably too much. They should go on maybe 3 pollination contracts. So they need a rest time. They need to go into good forage, but we have huge issues with available land. Beekeepers can't access all the good wild lands. Some of that's prohibited. We can't go into those areas. So beekeepers are finding a hard time finding really good locations for the bees to get forage. It's a huge issue.
About the nutrition, if your bees are on one crop for 6 weeks, there must be a limited number of amino acids in that particular crop to feed those new bees with. Are you supplementing them when they're in that situation? You say they go to other forage in between times, but for that 6 weeks or whatever, that's all they're getting.
Yeah, so I don't supplement. The one crop that I pollinate that's really hard on my bees is watermelon. The flowers are small, there's a little bit of nectar and very little pollen. So I actually feed a little bit of syrup when they're on watermelon pollination, but I'm trying not to keep them in there long enough. I get them out and back on better forage. But many of the commercial beekeepers, depending on the crop, like cranberry, if they go into cranberry, they'll feed them protein while they're in cranberry. So there is an issue. There's a definite nutrition issue in certain crops, yes. Yep.
I've heard it said from the non-treatment camp that beekeepers intervene too soon when treating for Varroa. We have these set numbers that we work to, right, depending on the time of year and so on, and we step in and treat. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and whether whether the argument is that you sort of leave the bees and allow them to allow the Varroa levels to rise right straight up, and the bees will start to deal with it themselves then, you know.
Yeah. So yeah, the question is, are our treatment thresholds, are they too low? We should let them go higher. I think it gets down to whether or not you think you can take the losses, because if you're going to go completely treatment free from treating and then go completely treatment free, you're going to go through about a 3-year period of losses. So I think you almost need to go, we say cold turkey, but maybe not with all your bees. Put some bees off in an isolated place and see if some of them can survive totally without treatment. And there is a question about whether we should change our treatment thresholds. And I actually just do a little bit without looking at the actual level. I know that I've got mites, and I know I'm just trying to push them down a bit and let some of the natural resistance come through. The one thing you do by treating all your colonies, or treating most of them, is you're bringing along some of the susceptible bees as well, the bees that are not as well able to deal with Varroa. It's a complicated kind of a personal question that, yeah.
We talk about splits, and in the UK we don't do splits that often, but I did splits this year in the spring and found that my mite control was lower. Is that kind of a recommendation to obviously try and do the control in mites?
Yeah, so you did splits and you found that the mite levels were lower, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say with, if you had 2 matching colonies in the spring and you split this one, but you didn't split this one, the mite population will always be higher in this one that you didn't split. So splitting, just pulling a few frames of brood and a small split out, it'll help the parent and it'll also help the nuke. So you'll just lower the mite population. It's very similar to swarming. It's not quite the same, but it's like if your bees happen to swarm, it'll help reduce the mite population. You might lose your honey crop, but the mite levels will be lower. Yeah.
On the definition of survival, I mean, a recent article I read on deformed wing disease was talking about the disease killing a colony in 3 years or 4 years. So if we don't treat, how do we know our bees are surviving other than waiting 2 or 3 or 4 years? And really, is that in itself a good enough result or not?
From my experience, it wouldn't take 2 to 3 years. It would, maybe not the first year, but by the second year, you're going to lose a lot of colonies in that winter time. They're just not going to be strong enough. And those that survive, if you look at the mite levels, you can kind of get an idea. These 2 or 3 colonies are doing much better, lower mite levels, and those are the ones you want to try to propagate. So you can speed the process by selecting from the best ones that come through winter. And I don't think you have to wait 4 years. My experience has been, depending on the mite level, and the winter, depending on your winter, winter is the great selector, for bees. Bees have to do a lot of things correct to produce winter bees, store honey to get through the winter. So, and they're doing a lot of different things to get through the winter. And those that survive the winter are the ones you want to reward and graft from.
You mentioned there were 2 factors for this French island. No treatment, but also they weren't feeding, so they were leaving on the honey over winter. Could you talk about the benefits of that?
So the question is, they don't really feed at all. They only pull a little bit of honey when it's really excess. So those bees are always wintering on straight honey. And there's been a number of studies that show that the bees will just winter better on honey. Honey is a natural food for overwintering. They'll do better. Now, my bees this year, we had a great fall. They fattened up on honey, so I've got tons of honey in the hive. But if I'm in a situation where there's a poor fall flow and I have to feed, I'll feed. So honey's always preferred for wintering over syrup, but we have to keep the bees alive too. So.
You've talked about, or the title of the talk was Hands Off Against Intensive Management.
Yeah.
The other bit of hands off is how often you inspect. Because a lot of our new beekeepers are taught that they've got to inspect every 7 days, and some of the older beekeepers don't necessarily totally agree with that. What's your view?
Well, so I pulled it out. I had a couple of slides in there of brood frames and stuff. Let's say you have 3 hives, and you walk into the apiary, and the flight levels in these 2 hives are just really normal. Pollen's coming in, and this one's like half the level of foraging. You don't have to go into these 2 hives. They're probably doing fine. Look in that hive and find out if it's, and then maybe you want to look in this hive to compare it. I'm not one for over-inspecting. And also new beekeepers, and those of you in the audience, we get obsessed, finding the queen and that kind of stuff. No. You need to learn to get into the hive, get to 1 or 2 brood frames, and just look at the pattern. Are there eggs present? And that's enough. You don't have to find the queen. And you can also tell a lot, even before you start pulling the frames, by the quietness. The more experience you get, if I open a hive and the bees are distributed normally and there's no jittery and there's no noise, no queenless sounds, I may not even pull a brood frame. They're just doing fine. So I would agree with you that, but guess what? Let the new beekeepers, let them do that and get, because it's fun, but you can't overdo it. You can overdo it, you can kill queens, and you disturb them. Just the disturbance factor is important. So I would agree with you.